many states and possibly internationally. This is going to be recorded as well. So friends may be watching this in the future from any of a number of places in the world, and we are so glad that you're joining us here in this moment. We are June 23rd, in a moment of violence and urgency and movement and organizing, and we are going to take a breath together and take a step back into the lessons of the natural world and the social world and the stories that you've woven together in this book. A couple of grounding notes. We're joined also here by Maddie Rose and Olivia Gamber, who I think is going to join us in a moment. Pendle Hill staff members who are supporting this program. If friends online have any questions, you can message the tech support Zoom Square, and Maddie will help you get oriented. And those who don't know Pendle Hill, a little introduction. Pendle Hill is a Quaker center welcoming all for spirit-led retreat, learning, and community. And we've been engaging in this experiment in spiritual learning community since 1930. We're getting ready to celebrate our 95th anniversary. And we've been blessed throughout those 95 years by seekers and activists and organizers and poets who come here to do their writing, to do their centering, to connect with each other, and to get glimpses of the future that we are building together. So it is with really great joy that I am getting to introduce you to Ricardo tonight. Our plan for this evening is I will share a bit about Ricardo, he'll share about his book, we'll talk a little bit together, and then we'll get to my favorite part, which is a conversation with both those friends here in the room and the friends online. So at the end, we'll share a little bit more about where you can get copies of this book if you don't already have them. But for now, I will start, in case you are not already familiar with Ricardo. Ricardo Levins Morales is an artist and organizer based in Minneapolis. He uses his art as a form of political medicine to support individual and collective healing from the injuries and ongoing reality of oppression. He was born into the anti-colonial movement in his native Puerto Rico and was drawn into activism in Chicago when his family moved there in 1967. Ricardo left high school early and worked in various industries, and over time began to use his art as part of his movement work. This activism has included support work for the Black Panthers and the Young Lords, and participating in or acting in solidarity with farmers, environmental, labor, racial justice, anti-war, and other struggles for people's empowerment. He was a founding member of the Northland Poster Collective, 1979 to 2009. He also leads workshops on creative organizing, social justice strategy, and sustainable activism, and mentors and supports organizers. The worker members of RLM Art Studio are represented by the Newspaper and Communications Guild, CWA. Ricardo's work is widely used by grassroots movements, organizations, and communities. And as I hope you'll share, you graced us with doing some of the writing for this book here at Pendle Hill.
That is correct, Francis. Definitely Pendle Hill. If you read the book, you'll find in the acknowledgments in the back a particular shout out to Pendle Hill, which over the years has offered me time to spend here writing in exchange for other kinds of interactions, conversations, and presentations. So it's very sweet to be here.
Welcome back
to this event, and hello y'all in here and all the other many places where people are watching from. Yeah. So this book really has come out of the organizing work that I was drawn into starting from when I was a teenager. And you'll find out a little bit more as I read some excerpts. But I've always been interested in seeing results, I guess you could say. I've never been attracted to that idea of, on my deathbed, I can lie there and think, well, maybe you didn't accomplish much, but I fought the good fight. Like, nah, that's not so exciting. Any good fights is not really what I like as much as the real differences made in people's lives. And so I've always had this fascination with what works and what doesn't work, what does make a difference, what holds us back. Why are some victories feel like defeats? Why do some defeats lead to victory? Just looking for those kinds of rhythms and patterns has always been of interest to me. And of course, we're living in a particular time where the tension between urgency and patience feels even more acute than ever, because urgency tells us quite truthfully that we need to move fast and respond quickly to fast-moving threat. And patience tells us that if we just panic, we'll break stuff and we won't get where we're going anyway. And that's what I call an organic tension. It's never resolved, only managed and in different ways at different times. I'll read you a little paragraph from the preface and then jump. I won't read entire sections of the book, but I'll pull out segments and that'll give you a flavor for the elements that go into this. Really, in essence, what the book entails is a weaving together of personal narrative, ecology, and history, which I think are the ingredients that we're made of, the ingredients that we need in order to be able to move forward in personal experience as members of a social species, for sure. And the things that are really separated a lot in our culture. And I'm hoping to make people who might not have had an interest in it start feeling hungry to know more about how nature works and how through us and how history is always present. So one of the things that I find a lot in conversation as people try to figure out the moment we're in, what we need to do, how to get out of this, what just happened, is the search for answers. And I've come to think about it in this way, that some questions have answers. Like, where the heck did I leave my keys this time? Right? There's a specific answer to that we can uncover. It's waiting to be discovered. But most of the things that we struggle with actually don't lead to answers, they lead to choices. And the choices are complex. And whatever choices we make, we try to make the best choice we have, and then also deal with the mycotoxins that produces. I have some examples in the book. When I came to this way of thinking by reading a book about detoxification in the body. And the doctor who wrote it was saying that 90 some percent, who knows where these numbers come from, of the process, the work that our body does to detoxify is getting rid of toxins that the body itself has produced in the course of its normal and healthy functioning. It's poison out of the body with a molecule that loses one of its atoms and itself becomes a poison, and that is it. I found that strangely reassuring. In its way, what it means is that we don't get to do it right. We just get to. So one of the examples is if we're in a campaign where in whatever town or city we're working on this campaign, win something, win rights, prevent something terrible from happening, and we're wanting to get our message across to the public better. And hopefully we're the media. We collect. You're pretty well known relationship orders. You know, look at or the more become the knowledge needs to gain experience and wants to be part of something that's not much always be right. But if they do it, it's gonna, the message might not be as clear. Right? And the answer to that is again, the choice, not an answer. So the hot shot for the press, and we have to create opportunities for the novice to build relationships with reporters. Maybe they can help write the press release. Maybe we can send them to talk to schools or other places where the speeds aren't as high. Or if it's the novice we put in front of the mics, we can maybe also create a handout with bullet points to get the essence of the message across and hand it out to the press. So you see, it's like whatever choice we make, even if it feels like it's choice, it creates what I call microtoxins that we then have to be able to process.
Okay, getting some notes that it's hard to hear. So if you cut that mic, turn it on. And sometimes we tell people to use their ministry voices. I'd like to invite you to use your protest voice. If you do want to speak a little louder.
I repeat everything you just said. That's working. So, well, I'll jump from that comment to a few words from the preface. What I hope these stories in you is recognition. One of the best things we can do for each other, and others, healers, leaders, friends, or lovers, is to remind each other what we already know. It might be truths we've forgotten, or even ones we didn't know we knew. But every time something rings true, it means it's somewhere in our bodies. One day become the bedrock of my organizing worldview. I had no way to understand that at the time, of course. The cycle of life and growth, death and decay, courtship and play, depletion and renewal on constant display were my sports, school, and television rolled into one. The blazing glory of the night sky and the churning fury of summer hurricanes were a regular reminder of my small place in a big universe. The sky provided the water we drank, cooked with, and washed our bodies and clothes in. Rain drumming on the corrugated zinc roof poured down its sides into rain gutters to be guided through downspouts into the cement tank, which was also our porch. Watching a lizard and a scorpion locked in combat is like witnessing dinosaur drama in slow-mo. The opponents circle slowly, warily, seeking any advantage to be gained from the topography of the dirt pile or the tree trunk that serves as arena. Two beings pursuing their raw agendas in the way they know, drawing on the senses and skills at their disposal. There's no good guy, bad guy narrative the scene can be squeezed into. Similar dramas play out all around, and I describe some of those. From our small farm at the crest of the Cordillera Central, we would look out on a clear day to the calm Caribbean shimmering beyond the grazing lands of the Lajas Valley, the low ridges of the coastal range, and Guanica Harbor, where the Yankees landed on that fateful July morning in 1898. My mother once called this the most beautiful place in the world, and it never occurred to me to doubt. This was the landscape I carried with me to the streets of Chicago when, in 1967, we left, blown from our mountaintop by the shifting winds of colonial politics and a mother's fear for her adolescent daughter's safety. At 13, Aurora was 2 years older than me, an age in which it was not uncommon for a neighbor to wind up pregnant. A different world awaited. Gone were the deep mountain slopes and distant horizons. Here in its flat cement universe, water poured inexplicably from flawless. You walked on bands of cement, sit on the ground, and the air reeked with sulfur and carbon monoxide. And so from here I talk about what was happening at that time, some of the shifts that were going on into this landscape that we arrived in. And to say that for me, it was like a mental attendance, happening, alcoholic family, probably high school, moving out of home as a 15-year-old sister also with politics. And what I found to land in were movements. And these were movements that were explicitly about restoring power to people whose power had been taken away. And that's your elevator definition of trauma healing. And so for me, and this is not say that this was anybody's experience but my own. But for me, that signal that you get back from helping people regain power is a message from my own nervous system. And I think that really helped buffer me from some of the damage that these potentially traumatic experiences could lead to. A month after we arrived, we moved into a brick row house on Hillside Avenue. The radio brought news of a group calling itself the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, that carrying firearms and decked out in black leather and berets had marched up the stone steps of the California State Assembly to defend the right to bear arms against legislation specifically targeting them. This dramatic act set off a flurry of gun control initiatives backed by the NRA and a flood of recruits to hastily form Panther chapters in cities across the country. And this was
We're having trouble here.
having trouble. Well, if we did not have adverse conditions to confront, we would not be organizers. Right, there's a very unfortunate saying that has become accepted as common truth and wisdom, that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results.
Okay.
That is really the definition of perseverance.
A different thing.
Okay.
Was that,
It's working now.
is it working now? Do you all agree it's working?
Yeah.
Perseverance. Yeah, see, that's good. So I was just describing the emergence of the Black Panther Party around the same time that we arrived in Chicago. The chapter in Chicago that was formed in the fall of 1968 would become one of the largest and best organized. And there was a lot that made sense to me about this group, including using anti-colonial language, which I was familiar with from growing up in Puerto Rico. They combined community service programs that address people's immediate needs, a people's health clinic, a free breakfast for children program, shoe and clothing drives, with militant community organizing such as police watch patrols and eviction defense. So I became involved going to protest marches with the Young Lords, who were the Puerto Rican counterpart to the Panthers, and the Panthers, later the Young Patriots, who were a white street gang who got recruited into their coalition. And I'll just read a segment about that. It was the Rainbow Coalition that left the deepest impression in my organizing DNA, based on its common sense humanity. This was an alliance between the Panthers, the Young Lords, and this group, the Young Patriots, a product of the Appalachian migrant stream. The Patriots proudly wore Confederate flags on their clothes and embraced the language of white resentment. Some of the Panthers had witnessed the disdain with which these working class youth were treated by white liberals at a public event and decided to reach out. And it's interesting, I mean, this made sense to me as a kid who had grown up watching scorpions and lizards, right? Instead of targeting these kids as being evil, they asked, well, what is their world like? And they came up with the most brilliant strategy to find out. They asked them. Think about it. I mean, it's just so crazy, it might just work. And they went to, they were shocked, the Panthers were shocked by the conditions in the uptown community. Some of them said they had never seen conditions that bad, of housing, boarded up stores, under-resourced schools, and a Chicago police department that thought of these kids as hillbillies, not as whites. Right? And so they basically came and made them a better offer, said, we're better off fighting for housing, fighting for, for healthcare, fighting for things together than fighting each other. And that resonated. All this made intuitive sense to a kid who'd grown up watching lizards and scorpions. People, like lizards, are doing their best to get by, get their needs met, and find a shred of safety. They don't always come up with good answers, but the search is real. The key to bringing people over to our side isn't about meeting them halfway. It's about making them a better offer. It took me many years to figure out that the forest and the struggle move to the same rhythms. Coffee trees and communities blossom when the conditions are right. Ponds and people get depleted if we're used up faster than we replenish. Some tasks are for the rainy season, others for the dry season. Trees with the deepest roots withstand the mudslide. And another thing, the life of the forest is driven by hope. It's the forest that sends the rootlets of ferns snaking toward moisture, mice scouring the leaf litter for seeds, and tenants striking for building repairs. It guides each living being along the path from what is to what might be. Without it, nothing moves but the wind and waves. So, yeah, like that, what I just said. So this was part of the introduction and the invitation into the book. And I really, as an organizer, I'm always thinking about how this lands, right? Some of the art I've created, like during the pandemic, creating images of animals, giving instructions for what to do during a pandemic, all the different things you could do, which I had to ask the question, what must it be like to be a 5-year-old in order to create art that parents and teachers and therapists told us was the first time they found a way to talk about this with children that was not frightening, that was comforting, right? And that's sort of the underlying principles, right? Of how do we blend together, I guess what I would call uncompromising analysis with compassion. You know, people are afraid that they're mutually exclusive, right? That I'll lose my sharp edge if I recognize everyone's humanity, or that I'll end up demonizing people and becoming just as bad as they are if I really call out the way oppression is inflicted on people. So I'm gonna pause there, deep breath, let you jump in with something, and then we'll find another place to read next.
I love that question of how it lands. I will say reading this book did feel like a gift. It felt like you were offering some vision and grounding. There are sometimes you read especially political books and they leave you feeling agitated and unsettled, and I think that the experience of reading this book is a grounding experience, which I really appreciated.
Yeah, and I could just say to that having grown up in a world of cycles and ebbs and flows where nothing had an on button or a beep or a fast forward is partly what keeps me grounded. Because when things happen, like a fascist movement, all of a sudden, shooting onto the stage, the question that immediately arises up for me is, what stage of what cycles are we at right now? And therefore, what are the tasks that we need to engage in at the moment? Rather than having my head spin going, what just happened? Not that I could have predicted that a cartoon character would become president and lead this process, but that during the declining period of an empire, during certain kind of crises, you get these kinds of things happening, and yes, it can happen here. That did not come as a shock.
One of my questions was actually about fascism. So I think mentioning fascism, there's a chapter called Facing the Iron Fist that feels particularly relevant to this moment. And I was curious if you could say maybe a little bit more about when you say fascism, what does that mean and where are you seeing it today, and where are you seeing the resistance to it?
Okay, so let me just find that chapter, page 196. Well, when I was young enough or old enough to learn about Nazis and about fascists, and I was born in 1956. By the time I was a child in the 60s and growing up in the 70s, World War II seemed like ancient history, irrelevant to my life. Now looking back, it's like, oh my God, it was just, the ground was still shaking. I didn't know that. But and one thing that always bothered me was that fascism, if the word was mentioned at all, it was as an insult, not as an analytical category, which meant you couldn't talk about the fact that the seeds of fascism are deeply embedded in the soil of a former slave society. You couldn't talk about it. It was always like, oh, that was then. We've gone beyond that. We're on this, unending march toward progress. Don't bother your pretty little head. Don't call people that. It's really rude. But that leaves you unprepared to actually grapple with the fact that you get these alliances between the wealthy elite and ultra right wing movements that cater to the terror of insecure, financially insecure people, and impose policies beneficial to the ultra wealthy, right? One of the things that I mentioned here is looking at some of the different ways in which you have these authoritarian regimes. Some might be called, for people who are sticklers for definitions, called classical fascism in the Mussolini or Hitler mode. Others are authoritarian democracies, right? Where you have very strong repression, but you still have elections. There are martial law, military coups. There are these different flavors, right? And a lot of the ways in which you resist them are very similar. At the stage we're at, the most important thing is preventing. That it's once you surrender the public square or parts of the public square, it's very difficult to win them back. It's a whole shift of how you struggle. And it's very inefficient fighting dictatorship from a position of clandestinity and having to hide. You hear accounts of people who are setting up a meeting with somebody and it has to be done very secretly, and you're meeting in a cafe somewhere and you just get a prickly feeling on the back of your neck, like someone might be watching you, so you hop on the next bus, and all of that effort is gone to waste. It's not something to romanticize. But I'm remembering secondhand, and it's the story is in here, I think. They have it. Yeah, so when in 1954, when members of the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party opened fire in the US Congress, shot around, wounded a few people, but they were drawing attention to the repression back on the island. There was another wave of repression, and nationalists, communists, socialists, everybody was being rounded up. And some of the leaders of these groups hold themselves up in little cabañas up in the mountains and issuing self-important sounding communiques. Whereas my parents and some of their friends went out on the streets, right? Organized defense committees, organized public protests, organized fundraising, and raised a ruckus, right? And I really learned from that example that when a repressive regime is coming into place, and I spent years doing solidarity work for people in Chile under the Pinochet regime, there's not martial law or military rule is not a new set of rules. It's simply the wiping away of the existing rules, and then everything becomes improvisational. We don't know how far we can get away with doing things in the public space. They don't know how far they can get away with repressing them. So there's this whole choreography of mutual testing. And in South Africa, in fact, there were some places where people could hold mass marches, and other parts of the country where that was impossible because the conditions were different in those places. So always pushing those envelopes. As far as where resistance is coming from now, on one level, we all have the antibodies, right? We all have the immune response to being controlled. That can be distorted because it's the same impulse that's causing people to be attracted to the MAGA. But when looking at the waves that have been happening, one of the things, I mean, I am always looking at what's not happening. So recently people have been saying, where's the resistance? Why is there, why is it something, how come people aren't standing up, right? And what I was looking at is the fact that the waves of struggle we've had in recent times, leading up to the uprisings around the murder of George Floyd, which of course was a few blocks from where I work. You had each wave seeming to be the largest in US history up to that point. Which means, I mean, you had all white towns in Utah marching for Black Lives. That means, by definition, the vast majority of people had no prior experience in protest, had no organizational containers, had no clarity about how you follow up on something like that. And therefore, there's a lot of the chemistry, or the emotional chemistry, the consciousness of many people often really gets shifted during these moments. Not everybody, but a lot of people. And then they just wait until something else gives them an opportunity to take the next step. And we were waiting for that next step, and thank you, Los Angeles. Right? And Los Angeles is now what Minneapolis was in 2020. The place where the flash happens. And of course, what they're protesting is a common experience, is a common condition, which means those sparks will spread. In fact, let me talk about fire. I'm kind of jumping away from that topic, which is a big one, but there is an everywhere all at once sort of aspect to it, because one of these few silver linings of fascism is that they attack everyone at once. So that we're starting to see solidarity moving back toward the center of the conversation. It's been really marginalized after 50 years of the nonprofit sector, where everybody's identity is a brand, and we're defending it, our intellectual property, and competing for grants, right? But we're seeing people really in large numbers standing up with real commitment and passion and taking real risks for other communities that are not their own, right? And that's something that is very encouraging, because it's been missing for a long time. It is the height of summer in 1791. The firestorm of rebellion races across the Haitian countryside, carried on the wings of rage. The glow from the flames reddens the sky. Plantation houses, cane fields, and coffee groves are reduced to smoldering ash at the hands of the field workers, seamstresses, and carriage drivers whose suffering is the secret sauce of the empire. Haiti, where black bodies are so cheap in the colonial slave market that it's considered more cost-effective to work humans to death than make conditions livable. In 1791, the embers ignite. No, let me put that another way. Embers of resistance regularly flare up across the landscape of the enslavement economies, but this is the year they spread. Fire requires three conditions to take hold: the heat source, fuel, and oxygen. Fuel there's plenty of. In the sugar mills, ships, and warehouses, where the enslaved labor in the tropical heat under the scornful gaze and biting whip of their self-styled masters. The anger of the oppressed is the dry wood of revolution. The spark can be anything: the sale of a loved one whipping too many, a reduction in rations, the rape of a laundry worker, and you might get an explosion. Then there's oxygen. Hope is the oxygen of rebellion. Hope makes dreams seem possible, even dreams of freedom. For several years now, rumors have been flying. Uneasy plantation masters notice a bounce in the step and a gleam in the eye of many of their workers, their property. Sailors bring news of unprecedented happenings in France: the storming of the Bastille, the escape and capture of the royal family, the creation of the Legislative Assembly. The call for liberty, equality, fraternity electrifies the enslaved in the colonies. If the monarchy can be swept aside under the banner of liberty, can slavery be far behind? The winds of hope blow inland from the waterfront, hop from port to port on coastal trading vessels, and bounce inland along rutted, winding roads in the wagons of merchants. All the latest news is thoroughly discussed and debated in the slave quarters long before it reaches the plantation house. To keep burning, a fire has to spread. Lightning might strike a patch of grass, setting it ablaze, but it will burn itself out if the surrounding foliage is too damp. It must burn long and hot for nearby leaves and branches to become dry enough to catch. Oppressors go to great lengths to isolate and contain a flare-up of defiance and put it out before it flares up someplace else. But the uprising in Haiti won't go out. The initial outbursts in the north have now engulfed the entire colony. It is now a revolution, well organized, unstoppable. A fire consumes its fuel. To continue burning, it must spread. Governors of other Caribbean colonies start turning away French ships, especially from Haiti, in an effort to escape the contagion. Some even ban all foreign shipping. By now, embers are smoldering in Jamaica, in Venezuela, in Cuba, in South Carolina. The colonial masters cannot prevent the winds of hope from blowing in from the sea, troubling the dreams of master and servant alike. So then, in this narrative, I pivot, and I say, in another century, I'm standing, a boy of 9 years, on the cement water tank outside our kitchen door, gazing across the mountains. And I'm looking toward the town of Lares, where the unsuccessful rebellion against Spain took place in 1868, the Grito de Lares, and talk about why that was not successful, why it did not spread in Puerto Rico the way it had in Haiti. And one of the answers can be found in the fact that I have neighbors with last names like Morphy, Agostini, O'Reilly, right? Names from people in places in Ireland, in the Mediterranean, in Corsica, in Mallorca, because what the Spanish authorities did in response to the Haitian Revolution is they made an offer to poor people in all those European countries that if they came to Puerto Rico and moved into the coffee area, they would be given land, access to credit, the right to participate in the slave market, so that they could prevent the browning of the plantation class, which had happened in Haiti, where you had a whole mulatto rising class, which was not reliable allies to the revolution, but neither to the elite. And they were helped destabilize the situation. So they brought that in order to wet down the foliage in Puerto Rico so the spark wouldn't spread. I call it making it wetter by making it whiter. So I won't read all the connective tissue. You can find the book for that. But I say that when walking around the house from the water tank brings the island's south coast into view. And what a view. The Caribbean looks so close on a clear day, it's like I could touch it with my hand. I can see the mouth of Guanica's deep harbor, where the Yankee soldiers landed in 1898, flanked by the high bluffs of the coastal range. Farther to the west lie the flat bottomlands of the Lajas Valley, a land of sugarcane fields and cattle, and to the flocks of egrets that shadow the cow riding on their backs or walking behind to feast on the insects stirred up by their hooves. Somewhere along that coast, Betances' promised ship was to have cast anchor. That was the ship bringing arms for the rebellion. But I talk about in the section I skipped. Beyond the horizon, out of sight, the Dominican Republic. Even on a still mountain afternoon, with the sound of hummingbirds whirring among the hibiscus, the invisible smoke plumes of history continue to drift and swirl. Visible from the farm, atop the high ridge of Monte del Estado, with the waters of the channel behind, stand the metallic towers of the CIA jamming station. Constructed in the aftermath of the Cuban Revolution, its purpose is to prevent stray signals from Cuban radio reaching Puerto Rican ears. Another rebellious island had shaken off the chains of its masters, and the sparks from that distant fire carried on the wings of hope must not be allowed to touch another shore. So I'm looking for the repeating patterns and rhythms so that when we look at events around us, we can hear the echoes of previous iterations, which is not to say the same thing is happening, but the same thing is echoing. And it can demystify. In the same way that knowing how trauma functions in the body, how it impacts you, doesn't make it go away, but it makes it a lot easier to manage and a lot easier to guide yourself on a journey toward healing.
That ability to go from history, ecology and biology, and then also how that resonates in a person's inner life is really exceptional. And I think one of the other places I saw that really resonated, I think especially here at Pendle Hill, is the chapter What the Sweat Wasp Knows. You can imagine that really struck a chord for me here. And I wondered if you could share a little bit about what the sweat wasp knows and what it means for you and what your practices are.
Okay, let me hold that because that leads me to another piece
Great.
that is on the way to that.
Oh, great.
So don't let me forget the sweat wasp.
Okay, we'll come back to the sweat wasp.
Right. What the sweat wasp knows has to be connected to what the writer remembers. Let me find the title pools.
Oh,
You see what I mean?
that's the other thing at Pendle Hill really.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I'll read you a couple of paragraphs at the start just to introduce the concept, and then we can chat about it. A wave crashes onto a rocky shelf carved into the side of a cliff, its surface worn smooth by the unending caresses of the ocean. Reversing direction, it slides back over the rim into the churning water as it gathers itself for the next wave. In several hours, the waves will no longer reach this ledge. As the tide line recedes, only the tide pools, depressions carved by time and motion into the rock surface, retain a portion of the ocean's salty broth. It's the intertidal zone, a band of shoreline that rings the coasts of the world. At high tide, it remains covered by the sea and lies exposed to the sky when the tide is out. As the sun and wind dry out the surfaces of surrounding rocks, coral and sand, the tide pool provides refuge for aquatic life. My parents' commitment to a long view of history prepared me for life in the tide pools. The waves of history crash against the walls of empires, only to fall back into the trough of the ocean, gathering strength for the next push. But even when the tide is out, when the flood tide of mass struggle has ebbed away, the tide pools remain. These tenacious political pockets retain the memory of people's movements and the lessons, practices, and principles of the freedom struggle, protecting land, protecting and developing them in preparation for the next high tide. So you have, and one thing about this, which I learned in the process of writing, is I knew about how tide pools were a place where there's some fish that only reproduce in the tide pools. And then when the tide comes in, the little fishlets swim out to sea. And that we have sea urchins and all these things there. But what I haven't thought about is that when the sea comes in and covers some of those rocks up, those pockets are still a unique little ecosystem under the water, because they are these little pockets of certain types of creatures that have learned to attach themselves and nourish themselves in that space. So that I've always worked in tide pools. The Northland Poster Collective that I was part of was founded in 1979, and it lasted 30 years until 2009, creating art that retained the histories of movements, right? And so that when the movements came back in, a new generation of activists would turn to us because we have the stories that could help demystify the past, right? So tide pools, the civil rights movement and labor movement both gained a lot of their training and knowledge in collective organizing at the Highlander Center in Tennessee. That was a tide pool started in the 1930s and it's still going. Pendle Hill, right? This is a place that weathers long periods of history, different ebbs and flows of history, and retains a particular drumbeat. That doesn't mean it doesn't change. It still continues to evolve. Lessons are learned. And each wave of tide, I know that when I first encountered Pendle Hill, it was being challenged to broaden its concept of change in ways by the movement of the day, right? Those happen. But that's an important thing to think about in this country. You have a lot of the nonprofit sector actually adapts to the changing tides of the foundations, right? So that you have all of these entities all of a sudden being, after George Floyd was murdered, during what I call the post-George Floyd pretense era, becoming really engaged in work for justice and racial justice. And then when the tide goes the other way, they adapt to that. It's like, oh, times have changed. A tide pool retains its integrity and retains those stories throughout because in the tide pools, we know that the tide is going to come back in again, right? It's not just surviving for the moment, it's surviving for the long term. So, should we
Does that
move?
bring us to sweat?
I think it kind of does. That's really near the end of the book, so y'all who want to learn about sweat wasps either have to jump to the end.
Spoiler alert.
You jump to the end.
No, I got there the long way, but while we're looking for sweat wasps, I was curious, the way it's written, it is quite cyclical. It doesn't really feel chronological. I'm curious if you had a vision that people would read this front to back, or whether you thought people might kind of dive in.
Well, it's written in such a way that each section is really fairly self-contained.
Yeah.
It sort of tells a combination of different kinds of stories and leads you someplace with that.
Yeah.
Sometimes telling you explicitly the way Aesop would in fables, sometimes leaving it hanging, but you know, it provides some connective things so that it's possible to jump around. There is a certain amount of building of logic as you move through it, but there's no requirement that you treat it that way. In fact, I had a lot of sort of thinking and rethinking about what to put where, which sections to put where. So yeah, you can treat this any way you like. It's good to start with the first few sections because they kind of are a broad invitation into what the book is going to be.
And it's super digestible. The sections, the broader sections are in shorter sections, which are just a few pages, which is like enough that you don't have to make a huge commitment to pick it up. And then you end up, oh, I'm going to keep reading the next section. But I found it really accessible in that way.
Oh, this is a short piece. I can just read the whole thing. It's like, I'll hold it up to the camera. You can see how short it is.
Yeah, it's not a course words, so
Yeah.
fine.
What the sweat wasp knows. It is our duty to fight for our freedom. It is our duty to win. We must love and support each other. We have nothing to lose but our chains. That verse is from a poem by exiled poet Assata Shakur. It became a staple of the Black Lives Matter movement, used as a call and response chant with which to open mass meetings. It was a grounding, a shared moment to remind the assembled why they were there, why we do what we do. There are 100 traps of forgetfulness we could fall into if we don't stay grounded, so we chant. It's a good practice. Our cousin, the sweat wasp, performs her own version of this practice. The sweat wasp is a tiny insect, actually a variety of bee. She can be as small as 3 millimeters in length. She lives in a wide variety of environments, including South and Central American rainforests. They're a versatile lot, with some solitary varieties and some who join colonies. The female makes herself a nest in the ground, or in a fallen twig, only a pinprick hole to reveal its presence. The ground, at that scale, is a constantly changing environment. A falling leaf, a breeze, or a rain shower, or the pause of a passing animal can alter the appearance of the immediate neighborhood. When she heads out to forage in the dusk, she performs a memorization dance, hovering in the air as she looks at the entrance to her home from different angles. She's imprinting the appearance of home to help her recognize it when she returns. She navigates through the jungle in near total darkness by sensing faint light patterns in the forest canopy. But when she gets close to home, she relies on local landmarks. Her leave home dance is a grounding so she doesn't get lost. Pigeons are thought to do this too, circling their roosting place several times before heading out to work. What grounds you as you head out into the swirling winds and currents of your world? How do you remember what is important to remember? Why you do what you do? How do you keep from getting distracted, intimidated, disoriented? Do you pause by the door to remind yourself who you are? Do you chant or sing or do a little dance? The home you need to anchor to might be a spiritual or political, not a physical one. But we still need a home to return to ourselves. I think it would be a fine idea if all organizations would chant their mission at the start of every meeting. They'll have to start composing more musical mission statements. Doing it together creates bonds of accountability. It reminds us that we're in it together, that we have change to lose in a world to gain. So, yeah, any thoughts from you, or maybe be a time to start getting some input?
Well, yeah, I think that is a good, maybe invitation to our friends, if other folks have questions, curiosities about the process of the book or the content. My curiosity, Ricardo, was this kind of turning that question back to you. What do you do to ground yourself? But you can turn it back to the community.
We might come back to that. It depends on what thoughts are turning in other people's minds.
Well, either friends here in the barn or friends online, you can raise a virtual hand and Maddie will call on you, or friends here can just raise their hand.
Or if you're not familiar with raising virtual hands,
You raise your
if you wave
hand.
emphatically enough,
True.
you get Eddie's attention.
Two folks who put the questions in the Q&A.
Oh,
Yeah, you want to read them aloud?
Well, one's quick, so maybe I can read it and you can repeat it. Did the Panthers also work with Native American communities in Uptown?
Can you repeat it?
Oh, did the Panthers also work with Native American communities in Uptown?
I don't know.
Great. This next one's a little.
As an immunocompromised and disabled person, I have struggled to find accessible ways to join the movement for liberation. I feel left behind by the same people who I want to be in solidarity with, and it hurts. Any advice for moving through this grief and finding a path forward?
Okay, thank you for that question, and I am looking for a piece in this book. Not that I have answers, but perhaps choices. You can talk to yourself, Francis, if you want. Well, it would help that I remember the title, right?
I will say that you, I think, mentioned a few times in here, the way that your sister navigates, some access challenges and the way that kind of the way that can open, that relationship opens eyes of the people around them. I was really struck by your mention of kind of the way that a sibling may become actually more aware and more responsive if they know that their sibling is navigating those challenges. So I guess one thing I would say is, Catherine, thank you for sharing that challenge and inviting us into that relationship.
Oh, there it is. Yeah, and I mean, one of the things about that is, I have a section in the book called Starting with Kindling. And the idea is that that if you're in the forest after a rainstorm and you're cold and you're wet and it's getting dark, and you want to dry your clothes, you want to heat up your food, you got to get a fire going. And what you want is to get some of these logs burning merrily. But if you take your one book of matches and hold each match up to that log, it'll go out. So you have to find the dry twigs and leaves on the bottoms of branches. And if you get a pile of that burning, you can dry out some twigs. And then the twigs will dry out a circle of sticks, and eventually you can get those logs burning. So that's organizing from the core outwards, because it's really hard to get attention to address an oppression from people who don't experience it. Once people begin to be drawn into the area and understand what that means, it's easier to expand other things, but it often takes a lot of challenge. And take a lot of efforts. And this is the cruelty of the struggle is, and again, I have a section on this, the struggle for justice and fair. And in fact, in many ways, fairness is not a reliable measure to be able to talk about justice. Complex topic, maybe we'll get to. But it does mean that the people who are most oppressed have to be the people who take the lead in their region, in their own building this right now. When we're facing fiction, that might just be existing people to be step up into their part. It's not to say that the burden has to be on the people who are influenced by it, but it's a challenge. And the thing is that the oppressions that are most visible, that are true to other people, that are the hardest to get attention to, are strategically in many ways the most important ones for other people to commit themselves to, because once you establish that those issues are worthy of solidarity, you establish that everything is. I have a section here that is not an answer to that organizing challenge, right? But it is an acknowledgement in part of my own invitation for all of our invitations, right? I say there's always that moment, especially for anyone not bathed in lots of privilege, when you realize that you are not actually included in the conversation. It's being assumed that everyone in the room has a shared baseline of life experience. Life experience that is very different from yours. Like assuming that everyone went to college, or to summer camp, or owns a car, or flies to vacation spots, or knows their birth family. It can be jarring when you're not expecting it. I once saw a documentary that touched on issues of equality. The filmmaker, a well-known political provocateur, also the narrator, was describing a poor black youth from his hometown who wrote into military service. They're being sent to fight, so we don't have to, he tells his viewers. In that instant, any young black man watching was informed that he was being talked about, not to or with. The filmmaker had enough political self-awareness to know that his relative privilege protected him, but not enough to notice how his use of language would influence. Some people's reality would be included in discussion, while others are not acknowledged. It's something we all experience. I talk about my native coworker, the conduct whispered at me, but he got through thinking this like it's your land. That he would not be well. So I then talk about my work at the visual artist, and the limits of that is there are I don't know how many millions of people, but my book knows who don't have eyesight, right? That there are all of these ways in which when I think a lot of metaphors in the book about travel, about movement, walking places, skiing things, visioning, hindsight, these are all in many ways equal. whatever language might be. And what makes it exclusive is if I use those terms. But if we use it in a way that it's not, it's unintuitive. And therefore, I'm sharing my experience. That, that can in terms of the question with I think you just did. In spaces like this, and for those of us who like speaking really want to insist that spaces include virtual elements. That while many people are not way to go just being in presence of other people, for other people the access to online, was liberating. Like my sister saying the time that she had to use a wheelchair and people referred to it as being confined to a wheelchair while she experienced it as being liberated by one. Right. So I just want to pause there. I know there are just some thoughts there because I don't want to be the person who pretends to have an answer to everything and who claims to be an expert. But I think that the most useful thing I can say is that the drumbeat has to be kept up. We have to keep up the drumbeat, not let people's consciousness slip back into default modes of being. Because that's what every advance requires of us. Every time that a tide comes in of any kind, we have to work to make sure that there are more insights and people left on the beach when it goes out again. So that's my attempt to at least acknowledge the challenge.
Question, how do you want me to do that so they can hear?
I think if you speak loudly, if you
Okay.
stand up especially.
Oh my gosh.
Asking
the introvert to move up front,
No,
stand up.
Yeah.
Coming out of my shell. So, when you were telling the story, and I say story because our experiences are stories. When you were talking about the Black Panthers reaching out to the Patriots, that really resonated with me because you were talking about, if I understand correctly, asking another group what they needed, like how to work together, and that sense of communication. And what I kept thinking was, today, how do we do that? And questioning it because now you were just talking about how the internet and online can be a good thing and it can be helpful. But I think of how now we're not having conversations. There are communities like the Patriots, maybe we'll call them MAGA, I don't know, or others that they're just mimicking what they are reading on media, on social media. And how do we have those conversations? Like how do we talk to people and find out, like, I don't know, like, is there a, maybe it's not a middle ground, it's what you need, and maybe what you need is to be heard. And I agree with you. I think that the sort of progressive political end kind of has discounted and shut out a lot of communities and built a lot of resentments. And so I'm just, my question, I think, coming back to it is, in this time of so many sound bites and spins on social media, and that's how people are digesting their news and not analyzing and not digging deeper and not in conversation and not listening mindfully and with our hearts to each other. How do we get past that? How do we rise above that, get through it to a place where we can, like, I feel like it's a log jam, and get that out of the way.
Yeah, well, was that audible to people online? Or,
I was.
oh, good. And also keep in mind that you have the option of putting on captions if anybody was not aware of that, so that you can also read along to the extent that the software works, accurately. So there's a couple of things, and you actually were already bringing us towards some answers there, in talking about people's need to be heard, right, to be recognized. But in the chapter called Lessons of the Road, I talk about when I was a teenager, I traveled around the country a lot by hitchhiking, which was just basically because it was, free. And for me, certainly safer than it was for some of my sisters, but still something that I could do. And as a young activist kid, I made myself two promises. That I was not going to lie about what I believed, and I was not going to get myself killed. And there's a natural organic tension between those two goals, right? And so the story that I use here is one of being in the car with a very right-wing Army colonel who used to hitchhike home on leave when he was a GI, and so he's paying it forward. He's feels like that's what he should do, and he believes everything I've done, and discounts everything I did. So we were driving through New Mexico, and I was looking at these colorful layers of geological history on the sides of these cliffs, and thinking, how many layers of belief do I need to go down to find a layer that we both stand on? And so I tried listening under his stories, right? And the stories were about, people of color mooching off the system, immigrants coming in and stealing jobs, queer people perverting morality, young people discarding religion and patriotic symbols, not honoring the service that people like he did to protect our freedoms and make the world a freer place, all of these things, right? And I mostly asked questions and then tried to share some stories in somewhat subversive ways. But what became clear to me is that his fear of Black people was racist, his fear was human. And that the things that were causing him all this distress were real things impacting his life, and the narratives that were layered on top of that were falsehoods that provided an explanation, but false, toxic explanations for those kinds of pain, right? That made me, or helped me, that and the Panthers' strategy shifted my thinking to one that leaves me not very fond of the idea of building bridges. And that meeting halfway, right? We're going to come up with a narrative that's half racist and half anti-racist, and we'll all be happy. Kind of a liberal solution, right? So, but how do we find the layer under which, under the chasm that required the bridge? And I think the answer mostly it doesn't come from trying to argue with somebody who is adamantly in love with Trump and doesn't want to listen to anything. Although if you can build a relationship where they feel that they're being heard, then often those rigidities soften. But I don't know that it's actually about trying to change their narratives in their head by going directly at it. I think it's about creating a center of gravity that is more appealing and more attractive. The farmer labor movement in Minnesota was, what it sounds like. Farmers and labor, people were being foreclosed during the Depression, and the organizers said, hey, the same bankers are screwing all of us. Very practical. Bobby Lee, one of the Panthers who led the Rainbow Coalition building, confided after one of the meetings one day, said, Rainbow Coalition, that's just code for class struggle, right? And I've been interested, especially in stories of neo-Nazis, fascist skinheads, people like that who have converted over to what I would call our side. What is it that caused those conversions, right? And a lot of it has to do with relationship building, but this one guy in what was it, South Carolina, I think, there was a movie made about him. Best of Enemies, right, where this local Nazi and Klan, he was in both, leader, would later join up with a black woman community organizer. They were thrown onto this panel about school reform together and started commiserating about their rebellious teenage sons and mostly the conditions of poverty. The movie makes it seem in a very Hollywood way that, you know, it was a random act of kindness that softened his heart or whatever. It was really the fact that they were talking about the hardships of poverty, right? But what I realized about him is that this guy, even when he was a Nazi, he always wanted what was best for all humans. The problem is he had a very narrow definition of who qualified as human. So that his relationship with this woman did not change his value system, but it expanded the family who could be included and embraced in that. Right. So that's a strategic advantage. I used to listen to a gentleman named Rush Limbaugh. Yeah, people seem to know who I'm talking about. It wasn't necessarily by choice. But before everyone had their own little pods to stick in their ears, workplaces had the radio on, and different people had got their turn to decide what was listened to. So I heard a lot of Rush Limbaugh. But what was interesting to me was hearing how Rush and Sean Hannity and some of these other far-right figures were spending a tremendous amount of energy trying to over and over again remind their own frightened white working and middle class base not to be curious about other people. Right? Don't be curious about Muslims, don't be curious about black folks, don't be curious about queer folks. And if any of those people start acting and seeming humane to you and human and sympathetic, that's when they're being their most devious. Don't fall for it. Put up your defenses, right? So what does that tell us? It tells us, it exposes a strategic vulnerability. That the instinct to be curious is an underlying condition. And it takes a tremendous amount of energy constantly to hold that in check, right? You know, it's a lesson from Tai Chi and the soft martial arts. Your enemy will always tell you where they're vulnerable. You know, I put a helmet on my head when I ride a bicycle. I'm broadcasting to the rest of the world where I feel I need the most protection, because that's when I'm vulnerable. When the right-wing apparatus puts all this energy in trying to suppress collective memory, they are doing the right thing. They are right to be afraid of it, right? So it again tells us where some of our advantages lie. The things that often seem to be where the other side is the most powerful, it seems that way because they are putting so much energy into reinforcing that because it's their soft spot, right? So anyway, a very interesting way when we think strategically on that level, what that means. But also it means that the people who are their base have soft spots, right? And when you create an alternative drumbeat with a better narrative that can appeal to people, people's political commitments, especially right now in this environment, they are in some ways very surface. People are blowing this way and that way. They're going to blow toward, maybe they vote for Obama and then they voted for Trump and then they, voted, for Trump again and then or for Harris and now, they're getting excited by Bernie Sanders or Ocasio-Cortez, right? The people are hungry for a narrative that's an alternative to an explanation for what their pain is. And this leads me to another part of your question, is that people self-medicate with what's available, right? People will use crappy drugs or abusing other people or whatever to recover that sense of being powerful in the world. And often it's very counterfeit, and you see these different waves also, so that when there was a time when everyone was freaked out about malls because all the young people, all they wanted to do was go hang out at the mall, right? Or stare into their phones, which was just starting to take off right then. And, they just don't care about the world or politics or sharing and so individual.
Just past 9.
Okay, I'm gonna close up here. But thinking cyclically, where my mind went in that period was, okay, where has the hunger for authenticity, integrity, and genuine relationship gone? Because it's not being satisfied. People always return back to their deepest hungers, right? Where are the aquifers where that is being stored? How can we prepare conditions so when that bursts out into the open, it will be in healthy ways and not in unhealthy ways? Right, and that's part of our job during the different cycles of the tides, to be able to provide that alternative. I don't want to disparage the idea of setting up community dialogues and those kinds of things, but even those are more effective when outside of that room, an alternative narrative of justice is being widely heard in the public square as well.
And I think that alternative narrative of justice is part of the gift that this book offers us. So I thank you so much for that gift. And do you have any final words?
There are no final words,
Um,
other than thank you all for coming, and yeah, I hope the conversation goes on and that what are embedded here become things that become useful in various ways to the people it lands with.
I think that's a perfect place to end. There are no final words. I hope that you all get a chance. You all get a chance to get this book. If you, Francisco's offered to open the bookstore.
I have 5 copies.
He has 5 copies.
For people in
Tonight. But the book will also be, the bookstore will be open tomorrow as well. And for friends online, I think Maddie put in the chat, maybe how to get it, or will right now.
I'll do that.
Also order.
And you can order it from Ricardo's website. We'll be sending out an email to everyone who registered with also the link of how to order the book. And so with that, we'll look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you, Ricardo.
Yes.
We made it, even with all the technical.
Yeah, he's getting that chat. I want to see if it's coming.